Hello everyone and welcome back to Chanakya Online Companion. Today's video is based on the detailed explanation of chapter Pollination and Fertilization in Plants, Class 9 ICSE. So let us continue. So what does it mean by pollination? We've learned that the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a plant of same species is termed as pollination. Yes, of course, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a plant of the same species is termed as pollination. Now, there are various types of pollination occurring. Some takes place in the same plant, but what do you think that those staminate flowers, what will occur with the staminate flowers and pistillate flowers? If you don't know the terms staminate and pistillate, make sure you see our video of the flower chapter and you will understand this chapter even better if you watch. So the staminate flowers, they cannot actually pollinate in themselves. So they pollinate with cross-pollination with other plants and other flowers. Now on the board you can see three terms each: autogamy, geitonogamy and allogamy. What does it mean by auto? You know that auto means self, geitono means neighboring, and allo means other. I hope this is clear. Next word that is used is gamy. Gamy everywhere. Gamy means marriage. So the plants which do autogamy, they do self-marriage. The flowers, if you see the structure of a flower, the plant may look like somewhat this. Now, what does it mean by autogamy? The self-pollination, or say the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower of the same plant and of the same species. Like if this is the flower, it will contain the anther and the stigma. So the transfer of pollen grains will take in this manner. Next term is geitonogamy. Geitono means neighboring and gamy means marriage, right? So when it comes to geitonogamy, neighbor marriage to the neighboring flowers but of the same part. So it may occur that the pollen grain from here may come to this part, this flower. So the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of different flower of the same plant and of the same species is termed as geitonogamy. Now this much is clear. Allogamy means other marriage. Simply, whenever a plant or the marriage occurs between two different plants. For example, if this flower is pistillate, it is having the female reproductive organ but not the male reproductive organ. Pollen of this flower may come to the pistil of this flower. So the transfer of pollen grains from one flower of a plant to the another flower of another plant of same species is termed as allogamy. There are two terms to discuss in this. You must have heard self-pollination and cross-pollination. What is self? Self means auto. So the process of autogamy is termed as self-pollination. Next one is allogamy. Allogamy is simply between two different plants. Therefore, this is termed as cross-pollination. Now, this may be a case that maybe this is a pistillate flower and this is a staminate flower. So what will happen in this form, that this will be termed as geitonogamy and this will be also a self-pollination. Let us now discuss the self-pollination and cross-pollination in detail. So the main differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination are written on the board. Alright, let us discuss the first one. No external agents required. In self-pollination, there is no need of any bird, any insect to come and help in pollination. Like we discussed in chapter flower, that the petals are colorful so that the insects could be attracted towards it for the cross-pollination, right? But here no external agents is required. When it comes to cross-pollination, external agents are required. There is importance of wind, animals, birds, insects, water. Not every flower is the same. They live in the different conditions. Like the aquatic plants, they require water. When there will be water, then that will be an external agent, right? So that will work as an external agent. Simply in cross-pollination, external agents are required. Surety of pollination. Pollination will take place. Like what happens in self-pollination, there is more surety of pollination because the pollen grains simply fall on the stigma of the flower. Here in cross-pollination, there is no surety. Maybe by the wind, if the pollen grains are coming, they may be lost somewhere, they may fall not on the flower, then that will be not surety. Weaker progeny is formed. Alright, coming to the third point of self-pollination, that is about the progeny. Progeny simply means the young ones. So when it comes to the progeny, there are not all the time the environmental conditions are not the same. So when the new one comes, that maybe it could not adapt to the new temperature, the new environment. So it is often that the progeny is weak. But when it comes to cross-pollination, the healthier progeny is formed. They are healthy enough to adapt to the environmental changes. Next one is nectaries not required. You know some flowers, they have nectar, the sweet fragrant. They produce nectar. So the group which secretes nectar is called nectaries. In case of self-pollination, nectaries are not required because nectaries are important for cross-pollination. The insects get attracted towards the flower and it comes for the nectar, and thus through some of the pollen particles are in their hands and their hind limbs, right? So that sticks to the stigma and thus the cross-pollination occurs. So simply there is no requirement of nectaries in case of self-pollination. Coming to cross-pollination, the nectaries are required because external agents are required, right? Next one is no new species is formed. The pollen grains of staminate flowers may be actually healthier, right? And the pistillate flowers may be more healthy. In some cases, the pollen grains would be more powerful, and the pistil may not be that powerful. So due to these differences, the species are not new in self-pollination because whatsoever type of flower will be there, it will depend on it. But due to the different species of the flower, like the strength of the gametes, this can occur that new species are formed. Here in self-pollination, totally pollen grains are used up. What actually happens that the pollen grains straight fall on the stigma. There is no really any kind of requirement, or it cannot really occur that the pollen grains are lost. But when it comes to cross-pollination, the pollen grains have to suffer a lot, or say that they have to cover more distance. So some pollen grains fall on the ground and some are lost in the wind, while there are very many chances that few pollen grains will fall on the stigma. So pollen grains can be wasted. These were some main differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Let us now discuss the adaptations for cross-pollination and self-pollination. For further discussion, it is important that you know these terms. Let us discuss it one by one. First one is dichogamy. This word means the maturation of the male and female part at the different times. To understand the meaning of any word and to learn what it means, you need to understand the meaning of prefixes used. Now here, di means different. So when it's dichogamy, it is a different time of maturation. Now we will discuss two types. The different type of maturation of male and female. So how can you recognize that the anther matures first, right? So here this first case is protandry. When we say protandry, it means the maturation of anther takes place first. For example, like in sunflower, the anther matures first. Second one is protogyny. It takes place in people. Proto simply means first and gyne means female. So when it's first maturation of the female part, then it is people. Except for protogyny, if you see something else, then it means simply the maturation of anther. Next word is homogamy. In the same way, these two words are interconnected. When it's dichogamy, that is the different type of maturation, different time of maturation. Whereas when it is homogamy, it means at the same time of maturation. Whenever the anther and the stigma matures at the same time, it is homogamy. Next one is heterostyle. The meaning of hetero is other, or even we could say different. So when both the male and female part grow at different heights, like the anther could be taller than the stigma, or the stigma could be taller than the anther, and due to this reason the pollination could not take place, then it is termed as heterostyle. Next, here this term is claistogamy. Claist means closed. Claist means closed. So claistogamy, it is a condition in which the flower is closed. The pollen grain falls on the stigma, fertilization, everything occurs. And what happens that it does not open until the fruit is formed. Like in peanut, you see, you need to break it, right? So that is just an example of claistogamy. The pollen grains of one flower cannot fertilize the eggs of the same flower. So due to this course, this does not take place in self-pollination. Now next one is hercogamy. Now you need to understand the meaning of herco. Herco means barrier. It means a kind of barrier. So whenever a barrier is present and it is a mechanical barrier, when the mechanical barrier is present and the pollination does not take place, then it is termed as hercogamy. Now here is a special word, parthenocarpy. Parthenocarpy. This is a condition in which actually the seed formation does not take place. The seed formation does not take place and the fruit is formed. Now let us just write the terms that what are the factors like which takes place in self-pollination and cross-pollination. First one is dichogamy. In self-pollination, the flower should be bisexual. Means it should have both male and female part. Exact opposite to this is cross-pollination, where the flower is required to have only one sex. Unisexual. Now, so what do you think? Dichogamy will take place in cross-pollination or self-pollination? Exactly, in cross-pollination. When we discuss about the same, homogamy means the maturation at the same time of the both reproductive organs. So homogamy falls in self-pollination. Next one is heterostyle. So heterostyle occurs in cross-pollination. Next one is claistogamy, when the flower is actually closed and the pollination, fertilization, everything occurs there only. So this will form in self-pollination. Now your question may be why? Why does it fall in the self-pollination method? Simply because here you see no other agent is required. As we discussed this, that there is no need of any external agent in cross-pollination. So in cleistogamy also you do not require any kind of other agent from outside to come. Now next one is harcogamy. Harcogamy, here you can write, and self-sterility also takes place here only. If you do not remember any of the terms, you can go back in the video and learn it again, because I want you to learn accordingly. For cross-pollination, there are in fact 5 ways of pollination. First one is hydrophily. Hydro simply means water. So the affinity of water. What happens in these? That the pollen grains are produced in large amount by the anther, and these you must have known that in water there is hydrogen and oxygen. So of course oxygen molecules, small molecules of oxygen present over in the water help the pollen grains in a flower, right? So this is, suppose your flower, and the pollen grains from anther, they travel along with the small tiny spaces, and even they may and they reach the stigma, and finally this way pollination occurs. In some cases it may happen that these can come up on the surface of water and simply reach the flower like that. Alright, in which plant the pollination occurs in this way is Vallisneria. Let's see the next one. So what does it mean by ornitho? Orni simply means birds. So any pollination, of course cross-pollination. Cross-pollination occurring due to birds means the bird helps in this process, then it is termed as ornithophily. Like in Kanna you can see that what is the importance? If it will be attractive, means the petals should be somewhat brightly colored, therefore only the birds will be attracted towards it, and thus the cross-pollination, that is ornithophily, will occur. Next one is zoophily. In this process the cross-pollination is taken by animals. Zoo means what? Zoo is a place where you can see a lot of animals, so this is taken by animals. Example of this may be elephophily. So what happens in elephophily? This pollination is done by elephants. What happens that elephants are large animals, they walk in the forests, and there are various kind of plants, of course. On the limbs the pollen grains are stuck, and as the elephant moves somewhere it could find a place where the stem and pistillate flowers are present, and there the cross-pollination will occur. The next process is entomophily. This is taken by entomons. Entomons means insects. Now you know that for insects nectar is very important. Nectar is the food for insects. So in search of nectar the insects wander from place to place, means from flowers to flowers. So when they come and sit on any kind of flower which is large, it is really very important for the flower to be large, to be brightly colored, and to produce nectar. If these 3 things are satisfied, then entomophily will take place. That means what? The insects will come in search of nectar on the brightly colored flowers. Now the pollen grains are very much sticky, so whenever the insects come and rest, or say whenever they eat the nectar, then what happens that the pollen grains stick to their limbs. For the same thing, if they go on any other plant which has stigma, then what will happen? That these pollen grains will stick to that stigma, and again remember that the stigma is also sticky, it does not hang out, right? So it also takes the pollen grains, and thus this entomophily occurs. Last type is anemophily. Anemo simply means the wind. Now what happens with wind? Just take the example of maize. Maize is a small flower, it does not require to be colorful or say brightly colored. These are actually dull green. The types of the flowers in which anemophily occurs, they are actually dull green. And what happens that they do not require any kind of scent, because scent is for attracting the insects and the birds. Now the wind, when the wind comes, like suppose this is the wind and this is your flower. Now one important thing to mention, that the stamen and stigma, all those things should be actually loose, so that the wind could take these things with the bit particles of and pollen grains, the wind can take them away with it. Now what will happen if these are in less amount? Like anything which is less, it could be lost, it could fall on the land, it could fall on the ground, and the pollination will not occur. So it is really very important for these pollen grains to be lightweight, to be smooth, and to be produced in large amount. So there are very much chances that they will fall down on the ground and they could not reach the desired flower. Therefore, when they will be produced in large amounts, they could simply fall on the stigma very easily. Now, you must have seen that different varieties of plants are produced from the same kind of plant. Now, that would not come so easily, right? So, people actually practiced artificial pollination. Now, this was first practiced in Babylonia. Of course, at that time, nobody knew about the sexuality of flowers. Nobody knew. They just sprinkled these pollen grains from anther to the stigma of different flowers, and what they could see, that new production was made. In these days, what actually happens, that humans cut or say remove the anther carefully so that the pollen grains do not fall on the stigma, and they cover the stigma with the plastic bag so that any external agent could not do any kind of pollination, and whichsoever type of varieties they want to produce, they can simply bring the pollen grains of that type and sprinkle it here. In these ways there are various productions of plants, like different colors of roses. So the term fertilization simply means the fusion of nuclei of male and female gametes. Now the male gamete is the pollen grain. This is the structure of a pollen grain, and this is the structure of ovule. Now see, the egg cell here, eggs are the female gametes. Now let us discuss this in actually detail. First, we would like to begin with the surface view. Surface view of the pollen grain seems like this, and there are various like structures over these all. These are the germ pores, and this outer part is called exine. Now see, this is the sectional view. This outer part is called exine, and the inner one is called intine. So there are two walls for this, the exine and intine. Now you can see some more things out here. This part is termed as the vegetative cell. Except for this is the generative cell. Now this nucleus is a generative nucleus, whereas this nucleus is tube nucleus. I hope this is clear. Now we have discussed the male gamete. Now it comes to the female gamete. Now you see this part of the gynoecium. What you would see, zooming on, this is the ovary and this is ovule. What happens here, that first of all, see, there are one or two integuments. 1 and 2, these are the integuments. So these are surrounding the ovule. Now here, this open area, means wherever this opens, it is called micropyle, and through this only the pollen grains enter. That we'll discuss further. Now as we move in, we see nucellus. This is the nucellus. There are total 7 cells, 3 at the antipodal side, 3 at the synogytes, or where the micropyle opens, and 1 in the middle. Now listen very carefully. The cells at the antipodal side are called antipodal cells. In the very beginning, here 2 are the synogytes. 2 cells here are called synogytes, whereas 1 cell here is called egg cell. And in the middle, there are two cells. These cells are called polar nuclei because they are all together. Now let us see how fertilization occurs in these both parts. The pollen grains fall on the stigma of the flower. Now the stigma has a capability that as soon as the pollen grains fall, they produce a sugar. And make sure, or say there is an importance of that pollen grain to be of the same species. It is not possible that if it is of different species, the fertilization will occur. So make sure that you learn it in this way, that the pollen grains of the same species fall, because if it will not be of the same species, then it will disintegrate eventually. Now as soon as they fall, this sugary substance is produced, and this sugary substance takes these to the ovary. Now during this course, the exine disintegrates along with, let's see what happens eventually. So this is the exine, and here is one nucleus, here is one nucleus. So exine disintegrates, the generative nucleus divides itself into two. As soon as the gametes come here, then the tube nucleus disintegrates, and these are the two generative nucleus. Now as you see, then these are the cyanogids. Okay, these two, and this is the egg cell. These are the antipodal cells, and these form the polar nuclei. Now this first one, it actually say that it comes and fertilizes with the egg cell to form zygote. First fertilization occurs for formation of zygote, and this cell, it is not going to fertilize with any cyanogid or any antipodal. It is coming here through this path only. It comes here and fertilizes with the polar nuclei at the center, with the polar nuclei. Now what happens, that two fertilization occurs, right? So this is termed as double fertilization. Alright, now the fusion of polar nuclei, two polar nuclei, of course two polar nuclei and one male gametes. So what happens, that three gametes are involved, right? So this process is termed as triple fusion. Now this fertilization is now completed. Now there are more things to discuss. What happens to these ovaries, ovules and all these things after fertilization? Simply, the ovules, they form the seed of the fruit. The ovary forms the fruit. Ovary wall forms the pericarp. The placenta, it forms the stalk of the seed. These are the two integuments. One forms testa, another forms tegmen. Right, the outer one testa, inner one tegmen. These are involved in the seed coat. What happens to the cyanogids and antipodal? They simply form the embryo, and these antipodal cells are disorganized. We hope that this video is useful to you, and if you have any queries, you can ask us. We are available on Instagram, Facebook, Telegram, Twitter, WhatsApp, and of course YouTube. So thank you so much for watching the video. You can share your problems with us. We will of course try to solve it. Thank you for being here.